Hello, my name is Buddy Stahl. I am a New Orleans historian. I come to you from this beautiful, historic, and really unique cemetery called Metairie. Our program is going to be called Rex, which means king, and Metairie Cemetery, the cemetery of kings. We're going to be talking about the crew of Rex and all of their kings, and many of them are buried in this cemetery. In fact, my mentor in this cemetery was Mr. Andre Gandolfo. He worked here for 68 years, and in 1981, he wrote this beautiful book. And in it, he lists that at that time, that's 30 years ago, we had 51 kings of carnival in this cemetery and 15 queens. There most probably are more queens, but the young ladies, of course, are debutantes, and when they marry, it's hard to follow their names. But nevertheless, at that time, 51 kings, that's a lot. So you might call this the cemetery of royalty. Just about 50 feet from where I'm sitting is a road. That's the main road in the cemetery. It's called Metairie Avenue. It's a 1 mile oval of a one-time racetrack, and we'll cover that a little later on. And by the way, horse racing is called what? The sport of kings. I'm going to try to answer all the important questions, both for Rex and for this cemetery, in who, what, when, where, and the all-important why. And in order to do that, we're going to have to go back about 15 to 2,000 years. 2,000 years ago, this was the Gulf of Mexico, where I'm sitting right now. 1,500 years ago, the river had moved here, and then it was ready to move back to where it is today. So this is high ground. We now call what they call the Metairie Ridge and the Gentilly Ridge, a few spots in the city of New Orleans that are above sea level. Now, when the city of New Orleans was founded in 1718, a very, very small piece of ground that was above sea level. Everything around it, as you will see on your screen, was either swamps or prairies, nothing the way you could grow food. So they decided they would have to have some place to grow the fruit, so they sent the farmers out here, where I'm sitting now. They grew the products, and it was called Metairie. Metairie is French, it simply means farm, high ground. So that's how this cemetery come to be, because of the high ground. That's how come the racetrack came to be, because of the high ground. In 1832, they decided that besides loving their food, they also love horse racing. So they built a 1 mile oval called the Metairie Race Course. It was a private club, very, very popular, and one of the biggest races at that time was held in the cemetery between two famous horses, LeCompte from Louisiana and Lexington from Lexington, Kentucky. It was the first race in America that was betting from coast to coast on this one race. It was the who's who's of Louisiana, plus all the other dignitaries from around the United States. We even had some kings of foreign countries come into this place to watch the races. If you'll notice in the background of the picture, the grandstands. They not only had one grandstand, they had two. The second one was for the ladies, and it was very opulent. They loved their ladies, so this is what they did. Every lady who came to the Metairie Race Course, when they got here, they received the racing form, not of paper, but of silk. Our next jump is going to be an important jump for both Rex and for this cemetery. In early February of 1872, the people of New Orleans learned that a very distinguished gentleman was going to be here for Mardi Gras. His name was the Grand Duke Alexis. This is the brother of the Tsar of Russia. In other words, he's second in command. They also found out that the carpetbag government, who was controlling the city and the state at the time, had no interest in even accepting this man. But this is a southern city, we like our hospitality. So a group of concerned citizens, and many of them will meet on our tour today, met at the then famous St. Charles Hotel on St. Charles Avenue. They said, you know, they're not doing anything, but we must do something for this man. Think about it. At that time, there were only two crews in the Mardi Gras. One was Comus, which of course is revelry. That's the god of revelry. And then 12th night revelers, again, revelry, no royalty. So they put their heads together and decided what they would do is they'd form a new crew, and it was called the Crew of Rex. Rex meaning king. So now we would have royalty ready to meet royalty. Only had 10 days to plan this whole thing. And it's remarkable that they put it together. On that big day, it happened to be February the 13th, Mardi Gras in 1872, Rex rode a horse. Didn't have time to build a float, so he was glad to ride a horse. There wasn't time to pick a queen, so there was no queen that first year. But in that first year, it was very, very successful, went extremely well. The Grand Duke Alexis was most pleased with what they had done for him. This is what Rex gave us in that first year. Number one, they gave us the King of Carnival. Number two, it was the first daytime parade ever held in the city of New Orleans. All the other parades were at nighttime. So that was the second thing. Then the king that year rode on a horse. He had a robe, purple, green, and gold. I guess the most asked question of me of Mardi Gras is, what do the colors purple, green, and gold stand for? Well, it's the purple robes of justice, green is for faith, and gold is for power. The more gold you have, the more power you have. And one other thing, at first year they gave us the anthem, If Ever I Cease to Love.
And swearing on my bended knee, if ever I cease to love, may sheephead grows on apple trees, if ever I cease to love, if ever I cease to love, God help me.
Later that same year, 1872, we give you the cemetery story. We had a gentleman in New Orleans at that time, very, very, very successful businessman. He had many, many enterprises, and his name was Charles T. Howard. I think everybody in New Orleans knows that name. We got the Howard Library, Howard Avenue. The list is endless. Well, he also owned the Louisiana Lottery, and I say that because that was big. It was the largest lottery ever in the history of the United States, till this day. It had 3 drawings, 1 a day, 1 a week, and 1 a month. The weekly paid for everything of all it cost, so all the others were nothing but profit. Every month they had a drawing, and we talk about the 1800s now. Somebody won $600,000. Think about it. At that time, when you won $600,000, you got $600,000. So he was a very rich man. Now, the racetrack is private. And legend tells us, now legend means there's no written proof of this, but this is the story that has been passed on, that he came to the Metairie Race Course to a board meeting in shirt sleeves, which was unheard of. But they were a little perturbed at him, not because of that, I don't think, but because he wanted membership. They didn't like the way he made his money. They were jealous of the man. So he politely tells them, he said, well, that's all right, it's your club, you do what you want, but I'll tell you what, if you have any financial problems, I'll buy the place and I'll turn it into a cemetery. They did, and he did. He came to the place and he bought it, and he did turn it into a cemetery. First cemetery in the world that is laid out on a 1-mile oval of a racetrack. Now, chances are, and again, this is legend, there's nothing written about it, chances are, being an astute businessman, he saw an opportunity to make profit. And I'll tell you why I say that. Just about 3 years prior to this cemetery being born, in Paris, they had the first rural cemetery in the world. It was called Père Lachaise, outside the city, and it was highly successful. I think Mr. Howard may have read about that, and he bought this cemetery, and guess what? After 138 years, Rex is still going, and Metairie Cemetery is too. Well, our first stop is here. It's a little monument of Francis W. Baker. He was not king of Carnival. Some people said he was even more important. This is the first captain of Rex. You see, kings serve for just 1 year. Captains can serve as long as they wish. Unfortunately, Mr. Baker died just 3 years after serving, and he's buried in the ground, and I say that because we have different type of burials, and I'll explain those as we go along. He was buried here in 1875. A few years later, those who loved him in that club, as shown on there, says he was erected by his friends of Carnival Court and royal host, November 1887. He was truly a beloved man. Now, we had many other captains here, and I have a list on the screen of 5 others, and you can see how long they served. There is no limit to the amount that they can serve. Now we're going to move to visit the first king buried in this cemetery. Now, just as Mr. Baker was the first captain of Rex, William Pike was the first king. He was the first Rex to be buried in the cemetery. Died, of course, in 1875. He was the 3rd king of Carnival. I think that when he died and was buried here, felt very much at home. And the reason I say that, he was a member of the race course. He was an officer of the board of the race course. And when they sold it, he was the chief negotiator. Yes, and when all the papers were signed, there was a big bell in this place, and they rang it. And that consummated the sale. That same meeting, by the way, Mr. Pike became the first president of the Metairie Cemetery. So as I say, he feels very, 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 very at ease here. He had a queen, and her name was Margaret McGinnis. She was the second queen of Carnival. So we had the first captain, we have the third Rex, and now we have the second queen in just 3 stops. Mr. Pike's daughter married into the Howard family, so they were all intertwined. I'll say this, we're a very short distance from our next stop, and I ask you please join me. I'm only going to walk about 100 feet, and we'll go to the next major king of Carnival. The beautiful landscape, impressive granite mausoleum behind me is that of the Howard family. I said mausoleum, that's the first time. Mausoleum is a tomb, but it has an entrance where you can go in and out. You can go in, pray, or meditate, whatever you would like. This one has a gate, some of them have doors. Mausoleum, by the way, the term comes from King Methuselah, first man to be buried in a structure like that. That's how it gets its name. There are 2 beautiful statues. One, of course, is on the top, and the other is inside the mausoleum. Both allude to the Old Testament. The Howard family wanted that by all means. Over the entrance, you'll see the letters IHS. Simply means Jesus, King of the Jews. We've already said that, of course, Mr. Charles T. Howard was the man who purchased this ground. It was the Metairie Race Course. Of course, he turned it into the Metairie Cemetery. And by the way, it's over 100 acres. It's quite big. He was also Rex in 1877. Now, he had 2 sons. Sons' names were Harry and Frank. Harry was Rex in 1888, and the son Frank in 1895. 3 members of the family, all Rex. And of course, Frank, I think, outdid them all. He has the distinction of being the only Rex to marry his queen. The theme that year, by the way, was Tales of Young and Old. Rex, of course, is an elderly man or a mature man, and debutantes are the young ladies. There's one more member of this famous Howard family that was involved in Rex. Charles had 1 daughter. Her name was Anne. She was Queen of Carnival in 1884. So it's easy to see why, with so many people involved as royalty in his family, a lot of people think of this as the first family of Mardi Gras. Just as this structure is most impressive, those within equally impressive. I think we all know that they were very successful in business. They were very wealthy people, but they also were very, very giving people, very much involved in the community. And I'm going to just tell you a few things, and you see it for yourself. They were most involved. The Howard family was the family that was most responsible for starting up the Southern Yacht Club. That happens to be the 2nd oldest yacht club in all of America. All 3 of the men in that family were Commodores. In other words, they more or less ran the thing. One other thing about that, I think you remember I said Mr. Howard attended the Metairie Race Course in shirt sleeves. They found that to be a no-no. I think this tells why. He loved sailing. I believe he was on his way out to the Southern Yacht Club in order to go sailing. That's why he wore it. They were also instrumental in founding the Confederate Museum. That's on Camp Street, and it is just the same as it was when they built the thing. Notice on the picture there is a large cannon. That is the Slocum cannon. I mention that because the Slocum Monument is just about 150 feet where I stand now. They were also the prime movers in the first public library in the city of New Orleans. Oh, Bud happens to be 80 years old. That was my library. That's every child's library when I was a kid. It was a magnificent structure. It was a replica of one of the famous buildings in Rome. Another thing they were founded was the Trinity Episcopal Church on Jackson Avenue. That is the most beautiful structure as well. Each year, the Picayune gives out what they call a loving cup. The first one they gave was Mr. Charles T. Howard. He was the #1 man in the city of New Orleans at that time. One last thing, so that his name would be remembered, the family name would be remembered for all time, we named not one street after him, but 2 streets had to be changed to use the name Howard. I'll try to explain what I mean when 2 street names were changed to make Howard Avenue. About the time the Metairie Race Course was being constructed, the city of New Orleans was expanding. So they decided what they would do is take and build a circle on the edge of the city, which we now call Lee Circle. That circle was called Tivoli Circle, Tivoli meaning carousel, flying horses. It was where the Americans could meet, just like the Creoles were meeting at Jackson Square. Now, the street coming from the lake towards the circle was called Triton Walk. The guy who named it had a sense of humor. Triton was half man and half fish, so he made it into a walk. On the opposite side, going towards the river, it was called Delord. The reason, Delord Sarpy was the man who owned the property before they built this circle. So 2 streets were named into one, and that was called Howard Avenue. Nothing's forever. So now, if you know, Andrew Jackson Higgins is the street that's named on the river side. It's interesting to note also, and this explains St. Charles Avenue. St. Charles Street at that time hit the circle, and when it did, if it would have gone straight, it would have went right into the river. So what they did is they made an offset so it would parallel the river. The name of that street at that time was called Nades, N-Y-A-D-E-S. The streets going towards the lake were called Apollo, Bacchus, Dryad, and Hercules, all from Greek mythology. The only one that still remembers is what they called Drades. We call it Dryad Street. That is, of course, is nothing more than the wood god. So you had the water god and the wood god. Nades is the main street that is used today, St. Charles Avenue, for wrecks that is their typical run on Mardi Gras. When Charles died, he lived at 124 St. Charles. People at that time were buried from their homes because there were funeral homes at that time. It was the largest funeral ever held in the history of the city of New Orleans, and especially in this cemetery. His funeral hearse, which is magnificent, drawn by 4 beautiful black horses with black plumes, glass-lined funeral hearse, started out, followed by over 1,000 people who were walking, and they had 130 carriages. And in between all of that was school children, because he was involved in starting the public school system. It's so long that when the funeral hearse arrived here, some of those who were still at 124 St. Charles had not even started. They had to wait about 2 hours before everybody was able to get in the cemetery to have the services here. It was the largest ever, and the newspaper the next day had headlines and a very, very large coverage of that funeral. Mr. Howard's daughter Anne, I already mentioned, was queen in 1884. Her king that year was John Schaff. That's where we're going next. Yeah, in 1884, John Schaff was an excellent king. And I say that because that was the year of the World's Fair, 1884 World Cotton Centennial. It was the celebrating of the 100th anniversary of the shipping of cotton from North America over to England. He, by the way, was from England. He came here to make his fortune, and let me tell you, he did make his fortune. The World's Fair by that time was held in what we now call Audubon Park. The main building was 33 acres. That was the biggest building ever built in the history of the world for a World's Fair. So people get an understanding of how big 33 acres is. 4 present-day Louisiana Superdomes would fit in the same area. The main building was impressive. In the center of it, there was an auditorium that sat 5,000 people with no obstructions in the way. Rex sat there, and everybody did, of course, applaud him. Now, Mr. Schaff was very much involved in the cotton industry. I mean, from beginning to end. By that I mean he had plantations where he grew his own cotton and lots of it. He had his own cotton gins. Here in the city of New Orleans, he had not 1 gin, but 2 of them. They were 2 blocks long each. So the man was very successful. The 1884 World's Fair was involved in the Cotton Centennial. Schaff was the king that year. Yeah, Schaff was from England, But he lived in Louisiana. He became a true Southerner, and he fought on the side of the Confederates in the Civil War. And if you remember that unpleasantness, we did lose. Most of the men who fought for the Confederacy were giving amnesty, but the higher-ups did not, and he did not. So what did he do? He sat down and he wrote a handwritten letter, and he sent it to the President of the United States, Andrew Johnson, and it must have been very impressive because in less than 3 months, he received amnesty. Had to be one hell of a salesman. Well, I don't want to mislead anyone because the 1884 World's Fair did start in 1884, but it was after Mardi Gras. It was not until 1885 that Rex that year did go to the World's Fair, the Monday before Mardi Gras, Lundi Gras. He went in a royal yacht and a flotilla of many, many sailing vessels. They went to the fair and went to the main building. Rex did something else that year to help the World's Fair. They made their first medallion, which we call doubloons today. One side had the crest of Rex, and the other side had the main building of the 1884 World's Fair. It's strange. They tried for several years to give these to people, and nobody wanted them. So they discontinued that, and went to Mr. Alvin Sharp, came many, many years in the 50s to give us the doubloon. A few years after serving as Rex, it was 1888, he finally passed away. I'd like to read you what his obituary said. He was upright, honest, kind, and just. Why wouldn't we all like to have an obituary like that? Unique means first, big, and unusual. Our next stop, I think you'll agree, is unique. Joseph Shakespeare, Rex in 1882, was a unique man. I say that because he was the first mayor of the city of New Orleans to be honored with the title of Rex. He was also the only mayor ever to be honored that way. He served not one, but 2 terms. That is unusual. He was a reform mayor. The first time he ran, 2 years is what you were allowed, but he went again, and it was a high percentage of the people that voted for him for 4 years. Now, he was a man that had a parade that was named The Pursuit of Pleasure. I think that was apropos. He had his Shakespeare plan. That was his main platform, and he had pleasure carrying it out. When he ran for office, there were 83 huge gambling halls. They were open 7 days a week. They were massive. When he left office, only 16 of them remained. Plus, each of those 16 were required by law to give to the city $30,000 each, a lot of money back then. That was to help the city's poor. Yes, he was unique, first and only mayor ever to serve as Rex. He was unusual because there was a reform mayor, and he got reelected, and he was big in the eyes of all of the people of New Orleans. Plus, what he did was what most people thought was impossible. He closed almost all of the gambling halls, which were called dens of iniquity. The reign of our next Carnival Kings can only be explained as chilling. Come with me and I'll explain that. Now, this is the final resting place of Walt and George Deney. Both of these men served as King of Carnival. I use the word chilling. The reason is Mardi Gras 1899 was the coldest day ever recorded in New Orleans history. How cold was it, you ask? The 10 days prior to Mardi Gras, we had ice, sleet, and snow, plus heavy, heavy winds. It was cold all over the United States, and for the first time in New Orleans history, ice formations made it all the way past New Orleans into the Gulf of Mexico. Thousands of people went on the river just to see the ice pass by, a little parade. A lot of people were brave enough to get onto the ferry boat, but they had to stop that because these ice formations were large enough, they were afraid that this thing was going to sink. On Mardi Gras morning, that was February the 14th, 1899, when Walter got to the den, before he put his costume on, he put on many layers of long johns. Then he put his costume on, and then he drank a bottle of brandy, keep himself warm within. He mounted the float, and he had another bottle of brandy. It was very cold. When he first saw his royal subjects, he had a smile. The reason is they looked like little penguins. They had all the clothes that they had, including gloves, and they were clapping, and he could not hear the signs. It was muffled. He was smiling then. 2.5 hours later, he was still smiling. It was frozen to his face. Proved that one thing that year: Mardi Gras is show business. History has a way of repeating itself, because in 1986, when George was king, another bitter cold day, but nowhere near 1899. Well, they say time passes when you're having fun. We're right back where we started from, sitting in this beautiful park-like atmosphere, and just in front of me, as we said, Main Street in the cemetery is Metairie Avenue, one time the race course. So this is the sport of kings, and we're surrounded by kings. I did my best to answer the questions of who, what, when, where, and an important one, why, of both wrecks and the cemetery. In a short time that we've been here, we have met the first captain of wrecks, the second queen, and the third king, and what some people consider the #1 family of Mardi Gras, the Howards, who had the father, 2 sons, and one of them married his queen, and a daughter, all royalty for wrecks. I found in doing the research that there are a couple of threads that run throughout all of these great men. #1, they all were king of carnival. And #2, all of them were truly in love with the city and gave their time, their talent, and in many cases, money to make this city the great city that it is.